I'd say the biggest challenge for somebody to prune a grapevine is to walk up to something like this and make decisions about what am I going to do here? How am I going to cut this plant, which I need to do so that I can manage the crop load on this plant? How am I going to know what to leave? You'll know what to leave by reading the text that's required in this class, going through the exercises that we do in our online class, and then coming out here to lab. When I went through this took me a couple years to really get a grip on what are the parts of the plant I want to leave. A good pruner who comes out to this plant is going to look at this and know, before they start cutting, what it'll look like when it was done. That's hard to do unless you have a concept in your mind about what you want this plant to look like when you're done with. And that means all you have to do, if you know that, is just cut away the extra and you've got what you intend to leave. Let me give you an example of how you can see what last year's pruning job did. We know that this is a cane prune system, so that we know something like this was chosen last year in the winter to be laid out on this wire so that we could bear fruit off of it. When we look at this previous season's cane, here's our evidence for what happened last year. This wood that's now a little bit shedding but bears shoots, or take that back, canes that were in position to hold fruit this year, that was last year's current season cane. And it came from a place down here in the head of this plant. From that head of this plant, a cane was brought up and laid out along the wire here. You can usually go back to a training system and find evidence of last year. You need a little bit more of a decision-making process to really decide which are the parts of the plant you want to leave. But if you go by last year's evidence, here would be right here. This section of the plant right here is previous season's cane. Last year, it was current season's cane that was chosen by the pruner and laid out along here because it had about the right length that they wanted to arrange on the wire. An example I gave to my employees when I was doing commercial vineyard management was, this wire is your money wire. Wherever you have wire, you want to be laying out fruiting wood so that you can use that wire to bear fruit at the appropriate spaces along the wire so they're not too crowded, but still not leave any gaps in that wire. Any gap that you leave in the wire is a lack of income coming into your farming operation. So be careful about how you prune to make sure your selections are appropriate when you go out and finally prune this plant, that you've covered up as much of the wire as you think you can. The nature of the Scott Henry system, and the way this is the Scott Henry winery, the Henry Estates winery that we're at, the way that it's laid out is there's going to be a high cane and a low cane. Scott's preference out here is on one side of the plant you have the low cane, on the next side you have the high cane. As you walk down the vineyard row, you'll notice it does the same in the next plant. There's a low cane here, and then he's chosen to put a high cane here. It's an alternating low and high cane. The objective of two canes is the high cane is going to contain shoots, which eventually turn into canes, which are turned upward and allowed to grow straight up. The low cane is supposed to have shoots which are angled downward, which allows you to have two separate fruit zones. Where these shoots come off of these canes, you'll have an area, say 3 to 5 nodes up, where fruit will be born. You'll see clusters of fruit up here. He has so much capacity for growth in this soil that he takes advantage of that by adding another cane and another fruiting zone down here. This is evidence of this season's cluster. So there was another area of fruit, a fruit zone down here. Essentially, he's got two rows of grapevines, one on top of another. A vertically divided canopy system that allows two panels of fruit to be born. This works in this site under these conditions. You have to have enough capacity for growth. you have to be able to ripen both the upper and lower fruit zones at about the same rate, so that when you go to pick this, you can pick this all at the same time. This is not universal. It doesn't work everywhere you go. We're just looking at this example on this site. So, I've used a bunch of terminology in trying to describe some of this. We've talked about trunks. We've talked about a head of the trunk where we're going to renew the fruiting wood. We've talked about canes and the difference between current season cane and previous season's cane. We've talked about the fact that you have fruit zones and you anticipate fruit zones, so you want to know this when you're laying out your pruning wood, your fruiting wood. We've also talked about using the evidence from last year's pruning to help you determine where you're going to prune this year. Most of this video is really just so that you could hear me talking and hear some of the vocabulary I'm using. If you can relate this back to some of what you're reading in your textbook, and when you come to lab with me, that we can go through this same process and we can point out pieces of this plant and have the same name for it, we'll progress rapidly through the actual pruning of the grapevine to the point where we're leaving the fruiting wood and leaving a crop for next year. I'll leave it at that, and then we'll address the next subject in the next video.